Welcome to Tuesdays with Lloyd. This is your host, Enya. Today, we continue the three parts showcase of U.S. Casualty. Our guests are Jillian Frank, Claims Manager of Canopius Syndicate, and Nick Hood, Head of U.S. GL at Canopius Syndicate. Please welcome Nick and Jillian.
Hi everyone, it's a great pleasure to be here today. I thought we'd start with a little bit of an introduction. I'm Nick. I've been with Canopius for 2 years, and I've been writing high excess US casualty for about 20 years, of which about 12 of those have been in the Lloyd's market.
Hi, I'm Jillian Frank. I am the Casualty and A&H Claims Manager at Canopius. I have worked at Canopius for 14 years, and I have been in the Lloyd's market for 18 years. I'm very excited to be here to talk to you about a personal passion of mine, which is social inflation.
So what we really wanted to do today was, there's been so much headline news about social inflation, nuclear verdicts, and we wanted to give you some insights on what we're seeing and separate out, give you some transparency and separate out the headlines to what we're actually seeing those translate into, and really then get across to you with Jillian's expertise and advice, how we can help our clients and our brokers navigate that and how it impacts you and what we're thinking about, and just create transparency around the whole process. So I'm going to start by asking Jillian. I think most of our insureds and our brokers and everybody, they're familiar with the concept of inflation. Everyone's familiar with a basket of goods, wage inflation, material cost inflation. And they're the inflation factors that I think people think of as real inflation and are aware of. But what do you mean, and what do you think of as social inflation from a claims side?
So that's a really interesting question, because social inflation is so difficult to define. And it's the reason why we're having this conversation today. A lot of people like to look at nuclear verdicts and proclaim that as social inflation. There was a very interesting article in the Washington Journal that showed there was a 300% rise in verdicts over $20 million in 2019 in comparison to the annual average between 2001 and 2010. This means that there is something that is changing other than regular inflation that you see on your carton of milk or in your electricity bill. We are seeing an unprecedented increase in the value of claims over the last few years. And when we consider this, there are multiple things that need to be taken in consideration. There are rising legal costs, rising medical costs, rising life care plans and wages due to ongoing life expectancy. In addition to that, we have changing social norms. These changing social norms are increasing the value of verdicts and the day-to-day settlements. What I would also like to highlight is plaintiffs' counsels are now using something called the reptile theory in order to increase the verdicts. And that's why we're getting these eye-catching verdicts that are publicized and shared throughout the insurance industry.
So what I find interesting when you speak to underwriters and brokers and clients is the different views of reptile theory. How would you define reptile theory?
Well, reptile theory is just such an interesting tool, and I will not continue to go on. I won't talk about it for a long period of time, because we could take up the full half hour we have today just to talk about reptile theory. There's books written about it. What I would say is that, for a brief summary, is reptile theory is a tool used by plaintiffs' counsel in which they have the jury focus on the callous or perceived malicious acts of the insured, which results in an emotive response and puts them in the shoes of the claimant. And they think, how can I protect myself and my community from this type of loss happening to us? Their response is punitive damages or high verdict.
And it's interesting you mentioned emotive, because there's a couple of things I want to backtrack on what you've said. One, when we're talking about claims together, we often, when we're talking about them and assessing them, talk about emotive cases, but also how that's driving kind of heads of damages, and how I think it would be really beneficial for insurers to see what kind of claims are we seeing increase in value more than a kind of wage inflationary factor, and how does that tie into some of the emotive elements as well?
So a good example of an emotive loss is wrongful death. In particular, we've seen a rise in the value of young men between the ages of 20 and 40 who have young families. They're often in manual labor jobs. These create very interesting stories that people can attach to, because there are young families, they have a young wife and young children, and they show the pictures of their life, and it shows the life that we know, that we see on TV day to day. And then you hear a story of how it was destroyed by the malicious act of the insured, and therefore they need to be punished. Had they not have done X, then this happy family would be continuing. It's a story that people can easily understand, and it does not require you to look at the complex details of liability and negligence. You're simply looking at the sad loss rather than the whole picture.
And one of the things we've looked at is how much a claim, and we talk about ranges and not specific, and every case is different, but how certain heads of damages, and I'll ask you to explain that term as well, because you're more eloquent at this than I am, how certain heads of damages have creeped up, and what they were 10 years ago compared to now, because I think not everyone will have seen that in their own loss runs unless they've experienced those types of claims. I think that's a useful thing to be able, for people to be able to understand what we're seeing coming through.
Yeah, so for example, if you have a traumatic brain injury and the person is no longer able to continue in their job, let's say that they do a desk job and a traumatic brain injury has resulted in them no longer being able to concentrate for long periods of time. We have longer life expectancies now than we did 20 to 30 years ago, and people are working longer. This is causing the lost wages head of damage to increase. And when we do that, we also have to think about inflation. So we have the longer length of time working in service plus inflation, and it creates a higher actuarial outcome for that value. The other thing is medical costs. If you are living longer, your medical costs are going to increase. We need to remember that emotive story about a traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injuries have dramatically increased in comparison to where they were 5 or 10 years ago. I see that as increased knowledge in society. It used to be you had a concussion, you rested for 2 days, and you were expected to go back to work. Now you have a concussion, people start thinking about the long-term consequences of that. There are films and documentaries that have made it very apparent and brought it to the forefront of people's mind, and therefore the jury pool. That is why we've seen a more dramatic increase in the value of traumatic brain injuries than we have in some other classes, some other types of injuries that we may see.
And one of the things that's really grabbing the headline news, and I think everyone shares them around, is when a nuclear verdict happens. And how do we see, I think what we see is we see two different patterns. You've got inflation happening because the cost of goods, salaries and everything are going up. People are living longer, so you've got a longer period of time on which you have to make those payments last for. But then a nuclear award is something I would view, and I think we view, as something very distinct and different from that.
Yes.
Can you give your
how
those two differ?
I mean, I think the perfect example is the $1 billion award that was awarded last year in Florida for a road traffic accident resulting in a wrongful death of a university student who had no dependents. It's unheard of, and it's an unprecedented reserve. What is interesting with that claim is the majority of that verdict was punitive damages. When we see the verdict, we never see the true outcome of the case and what it settles at. This will be appealed. No one is talking about what happened at the trial, and every trial is different, and we have to look at those trials and dissect to see what has been appropriate and what has not been appropriate. As a claims manager, my role is to assess risk and to consider risk and give guidance to the insured, to defense counsel, and to the market who follows me on any risk that I may have. So when we think of nuclear verdicts, we shouldn't see that as a punctuation mark. We should see it more as a comma as to what is going to come next.
And going back to that, I mean, well, actually trying to think which way is the best way of going on from this. I think it doesn't make more sense for us to talk here about how we overcome nuclear awards, and maybe talk about, you know, the approach of out-of-court settlements. Or what I find really interesting is how you approach claims, and how you engage with our insureds and our clients in that process to help, because we're given some bad news headlines out there.
Yeah.
But what the real value added of people like you and the Lloyd's market on a claims perspective is how to mitigate those issues and how to prevent those issues. So can we talk a wee bit, can you talk us through how you go around engaging with an insured, how we consider those things and work with them to get the best possible outcome?
Yeah. So I think what we really need to do is talk about notification. What should we do? Because there's several steps that take place before you get to verdict. It's the rarity that you have a case that goes to trial, and that's why I find it so fascinating that everybody wants to talk about nuclear verdicts and nobody wants to talk about what's actually happening in your death and not publicized. So I think the most important thing that can be done when you have a major loss is to, one, preserve evidence. It's so important that we have the preservation of evidence. Two, we ensure that it is reported to the Lloyd's market via your broker as soon as possible to us. The next thing I would say is, if you're uncertain of what to do, how to handle a claim, you have an amazing group of claims adjusters and claims managers with hundreds of years of experience sitting in the Lloyd's market. One of the unique features of us is that we work together. On any given contract, you are likely to have multiple follows. And as such, we have market meetings where we come together and we discuss claims and we discuss strategy. And it allows for a collaborative spirit to help ensure that the best possible outcome is reached. So please reach out to us, ask us for help, because that's what we're here for. And we love talking about claims and we love sharing our knowledge.
So I think one of the key benefits is, due to the Lloyd's claims handling process, you have one lead market.
Correct.
So as an insured, you're dealing with one voice.
Mm-hmm.
So you have clarity of communication there. But that one voice is representative of a hive mind of experience to give you access to a way broader range of experience than just that one voice, but it's in a nice controlled manner that's easy for the insured to deal with. Is that a fair enough summary of kind of how you guys engage?
Yes, that is a fair summary. It's good because everyone who comes to the table on a claim has a slightly different perspective and slightly different ways of handling things. So we come to a consensus when we are at the table of how to move forward on this claim. And they're all your insurers, and we're all working together to ensure that this claim is handled as best as possible and with utmost good faith in mind.
And due to the variance in values of claims, you know, which there's always been due to jurisdiction, individual circumstances, but especially with inflation and nuclear verdicts, how do you go about setting a reserve and working with an insured on that process?
Yeah, so setting a reserve is such an interesting process. It's an art and a science. So there's some things that when we talked about heads of damages earlier that are very clear that you have this value that's attached to the claim. And then we have the art, which is the what is the pain and suffering worth? How is this going to be seen by a judge, a jury? How does negligence apply in this particular manner? So we want to work in a collaborative manner. Whenever we have a large reserve being entered, we like to discuss it with our monitoring council. We send out key event protocols to the market, telling them that there is a potential for a large reserve to be entered on a particular claim, and invite them to market meetings. We want to engage early with all parties and ensure that we have the correct financial provisions entered as soon as possible. Very key to this is the Canopius reserving philosophy, which is realistic pessimism. We not only look at what the claim is worth today, but what it could potentially be worth in the future and what potential outcomes could happen, which is possibly deterioration or possibly improvement. This prevents step reserving and ensures that when it comes to settlement, that we're able to move quickly.
Great, thank you. And then I think one of the other things everyone's been concerned about is with the pandemic, the court system closed down. Can you tell us what you've seen from the claims process? Because, you know, did inflation continue with that? And have we seen a different approach to different types of claims due to that shutdown?
Yeah, so the pandemic was a very interesting time for every claims manager. We were advised that us and our teams had to continue operating as normal despite being at our kitchen tables for multiple months on end. The interesting thing is that in 2020, when the lockdown first happened, we saw an increase of settlements, and it was very advantageous to insurers. So we were working very hard, looking to settle the claims. This then resulted in us having a backlog of claims that we were unable to settle. So the majority that we could settle, we went for it, and we got some great outcomes for our insureds. Then in 2021, we saw the return of nuclear verdicts. And this can be seen in the $352 million verdict in Texas for paraplegia and the $1 billion verdict, amongst many others. I'm sure all of us can come up with other numbers as well. Now we're starting to really see the courts open again and people get back to some sense of normalcy. And I truly believe in 2022, it's going to give us more insight in where we are proceeding. Is it going to continue to increase, or are we going to see a leveling out of the large verdicts? I do believe that everybody loves a large verdict, and some juries are going to be interested in giving large numbers for people to have discussions about. So they're not going away. We will continue to see some large verdicts.
And that ties in, I'm just keeping an eye on the Q&A, that's why I keep moving backwards and forwards. I feel like woodpecker. One of the questions is, do you think that we'll ever get to a level of frequency or severity of these claims that will result in tort reform?
In the United States?
In the US, yeah.
So on a federal basis or on a state-by-state basis?
The question doesn't go into that, but I imagine we could approach it on both.
So federally, I think it would be very difficult to do that. On a state-by-state basis, well, you have seen it in some states with medical med mal. So you have seen some caps and things like that put into place. So it potentially could happen. I have not heard any rumblings of anyone looking for that. So I think if people want it, then contact your local representatives and they can do it for you, hopefully.
I think one of the things that kind of comes back to is what we've also seen, which I haven't prepped you for at all this
Oh,
question, so
no.
sorry, is historically there were states that were seen as more business friendly and some that were more litigious. Have you seen a change in that? Because I think as an underwriter, I have definitely started to see, driven by our discussions and claims, changes to prior perceptions I would have had on specific states.
Yes, there are, and I don't want to start naming states out. I don't want states to go, oh, don't want Jillian coming to our state. We do see changes. There's been demographic changes in the United States over the last 10 years, which has definitely changed the demographic of juries in what we traditionally considered safe states. So with that, we should expect there to be changes. For example, there's been a migration from the north to the south of the United States, and that's caused changes in the general perception and the jury pool in those states.
We've got another question, which is how are underwriters reacting with claims inflation in terms of limits they're prepared to write and upward premium changes for today and going forward? I want to kind of answer that question in a couple of ways. I think I'll discuss with, maybe if we take it in the first part about how we engage with our claims team to get an idea of how we do these things. And I don't know whether you want to go through this, but one of the things I've been really impressed with since I joined Canopius is how aligned we are between claims and underwriting, how much communication there is, how much openness there is, and how since returning to an office that now is on a, what we call ourselves, active working, where you move around. Again, you're more
agile working we have at Canopius. Yeah, so I mean, agile working I think is great. So I'm able to sit next to Nick, and I hear her talking about the policies she's writing. She hears me on the phone to brokers. She hears me talking about claims, and there's this almost osmosis of information that happens as a result of us being able to be in close proximity of it. Additionally, we have actuarial on the same floor. So you're going to get a cup of tea or coffee and you start talking about the claims and you start sharing your information that way. I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk about our social inflation working group. At Canopius, we've had a social inflation working group since 2019. So when this was a mere whisper in the market, we were already looking into it on the casualty lines of business.
We have formal weekly catch-ups in addition. I think one of the things I benefit from as an underwriter is when we get a new submission with open claims, it can be hard to assess them, and I can engage with Jillian and say, what do you think the real value of this is? Because for me, what is key is when you go onto an account as a new piece of business, you want longevity of the relationship. So you want to go in to the relationship with your eyes open on what they're seeing and what they're experiencing, to make sure you attach at the right part of the program with the right premium and the right terms and conditions to make it a long-term sustainable relationship. And back to the question about how we react to inflation in terms of limits, I think everyone's seen over the past 2 years that carriers have reduced limits, and that's come from two bits. One, with a smaller limit, you can absorb those nuclear verdicts when they happen a lot more easily. So on a very high excess basis, do you want to have a $50 million line exposed or a $10 million line exposed? When we don't, let's face it, we don't know if and when a nuclear verdict will happen and how frequent they will happen. One of the easiest things we can control is how much our exposure is to that. And then we've been looking at, specifically for us, we've been looking at frequency and severity at different layers and programs and making sure that on our accounts as a whole, we have a reasonable payback. So we're trying to think of that. It is a very tough conversation to have with clients and brokers because the inflation factors are unquantifiable. One of the items that we often see is a client can have a fabulously clean loss record until tomorrow. And then the bad thing happens. And I think, again, it's not just about price, it's terms and conditions, attachment point. And that's, I think, where the claims value proposition comes in. Yeah. Because, and you might be better speaking to this than I am, but a client that hasn't had one of the large awards for a long time, that hasn't seen a TBI for a number of years, or hasn't ever been exposed to a particularly hostile plaintiff's attorney. And I think there are a couple of points we should kind of go into before we run out of time, and how we'd approach that and address those items with clients.
So if the last time you had a major claim was 10 years ago, it has seriously changed the forum, the way plaintiffs' attorneys respond. And it might be shocking, because the last time you had a serious claim, it was worth roughly $3 million, and all of a sudden you're being told it's worth $15 million, and there's a shock factor. And that is where we come in. Being collaborative is a pillar of the Canopius claims philosophy and vision. So we want to be there. We are happy. You are our client. The broker is our client. And we want to discuss this with you and make the journey as smooth as possible. You've already had a shock event, and this is where we come in and we help. So that is the key, is to just be open and honest with one another. The other thing that I think should be considered is plaintiff's counsel. And there's strategies such as reptile theory and various other things that they will do, such as jurisdiction, forum shopping, etc., that we can help with. We know what various plaintiffs' firms, we know who the people who like to get large verdicts and take things to trial are, who they are, and we can help assist and give guidance on files. If we hire monitoring counsel, it's really just to give you another set of eyes, another set of hands to help you with the claim and to help move it forward.
And I'm just going to go back to the Q&A now. We've had a question about, does Lloyd's maintain a database of large liability verdicts? I don't know the answer to that one. I'm afraid I don't know.
No, we do not have a database. I think it's called our memories.
And then we've had a question about business planning and inflation. That is a tricky one. We've been asked, do you support claims inflation assumptions in the business plan? And what considerations do you give to estimate a single number for claims? We do consider claims inflation in the business planning process. We constantly review and engage in lively discussions around that item. As I've mentioned before, I personally don't believe there's a single quantifiable inflation number that you can just put in, but there is a benefit to making sure as a syndicate and as an underwriter that you are considering it in your pricing, your reserving, your estimates of loss, your reserving patterns, and your business plan assumptions. And then we've had another question about, is there such a thing as price adequacy, or will insureds always see increases for social inflation? Again, that's a really, really difficult question to answer. I used to work with an actuary whose view was that the price is always wrong, because if you don't have a loss, you charge too much, and if you do have a loss, you didn't charge anywhere near enough. It's something that we do need to be extremely mindful of, and we need to be proactively managing in our pricing and considering. But there are other ways of managing it beyond price alone, which can be attachment point, where you're looking at what kind of, as Jillian mentioned, we're seeing certain heads of damages increase. So kind of looking at where we're seeing particular awards going up. Do you want to reposition your portfolio away from such areas? One of the things we've talked about, TBI awards going up, wrongful deaths going up, wrongful imprisonment going up. So again, I've not particularly answered your question, but it's to say there's more than just price. And for me, what's really important remains communicating with your claims team and actually knowing what's happening and being proactive about it and actively considering it in your day-to-day underwriting. I'm incredibly fortunate that we work with amazing risk managers who are always on top of what their exposures are and how to mitigate and how to handle things and how to react to things, and having open and honest conversations with them about what they're seeing and how they're mitigating it, so we can address it on a number of levels. And then an anonymous, do I think do you think rate in the market is keeping up with social inflation? Again, because I can't quantify an amount for social inflation, I can't really answer the question.
I think that's $1 million question, isn't
Yeah,
it?
if I had the answer, I would let you know. It is keeping a pace at the moment with what I would track as real inflation factors. So the things that are more easily measurable within a year, such as medical costs, legal costs, wage inflation, those things that you can put a number on per annum. It is keeping track with that at the moment.
It's that emotive cost.
The emotive cost and the claims jump for certain things.
Yeah.
That's a really difficult bit to quantify. And also with liability, real inflation doesn't always translate purely to an absolute increase in the award.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that it's not just you've had a 5% increase in your salary, you're going to get 5% more in the award amount.
No. A claims inflation is definitely increasing at a rate greater than our day-to-day inflation that we're seeing in the grocery store or at the gas station around the corner.
But we see some insureds on the low-level claims, and a slip, trip, or fall type thing is still the same, or around about the same value as a slip, trip, and fall. Has been, but there's just those spikes that are.
And I saw a study recently which did show that there is a gradual increase on the lower value claims. It really comes down to these matters that have a story that you can talk about, that you can understand, where we're seeing that large jump. There is a day-to-day increase on our smaller slip and trip claims. We are not seeing it in the same way that social inflation as you do on the larger claims. So we shouldn't deminimize the impact of inflation on those. And I think if you were to look at a more standard traumatic brain injury, that, for example, has increased from 5 years ago. So if you have a concussion where you are not well for a week, I do believe that has increased in comparison to where it was 5 to 10 years ago.
I think we're now out of time, so I'm just going to do a very quick wrap up, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. Back to the myth or reality, we think it is a reality. We are seeing the effects of inflation, and it's beyond just the medical and payroll and kind of standard inflationary factors. And we're seeing, in particular, certain types of claim values increase at a pace that is greater than a set rate of inflation. However, we do strongly believe that Lloyd's can add value to this process, because when you have a Lloyd's panel on your program, you're getting the experience of a whole marketplace coming to you. If you've not had a large loss in a number of years, we're seeing what's happening day to day. We can help guide you, influence the decisions. We've got numerous examples of where we've been able to bring a claims in at far lower than expectations.
Yeah.
We can provide that advice, and we're contactable and we're engaged, and we view our insurance and our claims brokers as the clients, and we really value communication and long-term relationships, and that's our service to you, and we view that as key. And we think by working with you and sharing our knowledge, we can work together to mitigate those claims and manage them and try and stem the flow of inflationary impacts. And I think, again, what I've kind of said in some of the Q&A, and I've probably seemed a bit too vague from the pricing side, a lot of it is unquantifiable, but we're looking at everything. I think trying to be engaged and making sure that we're aware and considering it and communicating it and working with our insureds on a claims and underwriting front to make sure that we can continue to provide long-term relationships and solutions that are focused on a deep understanding of your business. I think that's it from us.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you so much, Jillian. This is grateful. We're grateful to you for your insight, which is super helpful, because I've been working with Lloyd for 6 years. I still haven't fully understand the claim process like you did today. So thank you. So up next, we have the changing face of transportation risk for feature Alison Timpson of Excel Catlin Syndicate 203 Edward Wallace from Inigo Insurance, and Philip Titley from Price Forbes tomorrow. So welcome back tomorrow at the same time. In the meantime, stay connected. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. We'll see you tomorrow.
Bye.
Thank you.